Hi, welcome. Day 2. To go back a little bit over day 1, yes, we looked at learning styles and preferences, we looked at instructional practices, and a lot of that was relatively introductory stuff. There was probably not a lot new in it for many of you, but nevertheless it's a way of validating the sorts of approaches, the sorts of things you might or might not do, and sort of really bringing them to a level of consciousness, and that's really what that was primarily about. And we talked about lesson plans. I'm not going to go through all of these, but some of the learning styles that we looked at were the Solomon and Felder and the VARK or VARK, whether you put the R in or not, and the idea of Gardner's multiple intelligences. And you might, if you've forgotten what they're about, then at some stage you may find it useful to go back and just sort of revise those. We did also talk about the idea of andragogy and the Knowles phenomenon, and we talked a little bit about the differentiation, or the way in which some people perceive the differentiation between pedagogy and andragogy. Essentially, I suppose where at least I got to was to say, well, look, what Knowles did very constructively was Knowles documented 5 principles of good teaching practice for adults, and there are those that would say that those 5 teaching principles are equally applied to younger people as well, and that the ideas of people are more likely to be stimulated to learn, they're more likely to be engaged in their learning if they're involved in the planning and the evaluation of it, that you build what people learn based on their previous experience, what they already know, that the subject has particular immediate relevance, like I've got to fix this, or I've got to do this, or I really don't know what's going on here and I need to. And that the learning is problem-oriented rather than content-oriented. That the learning is related to solving a set of issues that hopefully are a bit immediate. Now, the way in which it seems to me that andragogy gets played out in some of the learning theories that we'll look at today is in the use of slightly different language sometimes. Like, for example, some of the learning theories talk about the importance of contextualising the learning so that it's not decontextualised. And of course, one of the principles of problem-based learning is that the learning has a context in which to sit in. So you'll notice that, as we go through, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot in common between much of what a range of people will say. Often they put different languages around it, but if you actually dig under the surface and say, what are the principles going on here, then often the principles are not particularly different. We talked a little bit about barriers to learning, and we certainly didn't spend a lot of time on that. But to summarise the barriers to learning on the left-hand side of that particular slide, essentially they'll be physical, they'll be psychological, they'll be emotional, or they'll be cultural. So an example of a physical barrier is simply that the room is too hot or too cold in terms of the environment itself. And clearly, people who have limited sight or limited hearing or limited mobility will also suffer barriers to learning. Psychological barriers, something as simple as the fact that you've got up this morning and one of the kids is sick and you've come along anyway, or something else is happening outside of your life, to the 20% of us that suffer depression at some time in our life, to the more sort of serious, I'm not underestimating depression, but the more serious psychological issues, emotional issues that we all suffer from time to time, and clearly cultural issues are important in sometimes people exhibiting barriers. So certainly when we go overseas to do workshops overseas, quite a lot of cultures have problems with the way in which most people from Australia will go about their teaching practice, that it does tend to be two-way, that there's a lot of open-ended type stuff often going on, where in some cultures the expectation is that teachers will give you the information and basically you repeat it back. And one of the people that we talked about in terms of good teaching principles was Vella, Certainly in my experience with teaching in this program, a lot of people tend to find Vela very useful. They seem to be able to relate to those sort of 12 principles of good teaching practice. Now I'm not going to go through them again, but you know, obviously we're going to keep coming across those sort of principles in terms of good teaching practice from time to time, whether it's Vela that's saying it or someone else that's saying it, or whether it's from your own personal experience base that is actually the case. We talked about some general principles as well, which I suppose would really derive from the more general literature and from experience. You know, the idea of active learning again, problem-based learning, the meaningfulness of the material. It needs meaningful to learners, but also, you know, sometimes you can make things meaningful by putting them in a context of one sort or another. The multi-sense idea, which is consistent with Gardner's multiple intelligences, is also consistent with that idea of the VARK thing, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic. First and last impressions, we talked about, you know, the importance of what you do first and what you do last, and people don't tend to remember quite so much what happens in the middle, not immediately at least. Practice and reinforcement, which is sometimes sort of called drill and practice, you know, sort of like doing times tables, or you know, taking a piece of machinery apart and putting it back together and doing it repetitively, or learning scales on a piano, those sorts of things, trying to get it right. The notion of two-way feedback and the notion of reward. And mostly these days we talk about positive reward rather than negative reward, I think it's probably fair to say. We then finished really on the point of talking about lesson plans a little bit and what were the purposes of lesson plans. You know, that effectively they're there as a means of clarifying what it is you hope to do from a teacher's point of view in a particular session, to identify how you're going to go about it, to make some estimates, how long is that going to take me to do, so that you can fit a reasonable amount of opportunity for learning within the sort of time frame that you've got available to you. As a way of sort of thinking through how am I going to organise this content, what is a reasonable way of sequencing the content so that it facilitates really, really good learning? And also, you know, from a practical sense, detailing the resources so that you've got the stuff that you need when you need it, and finally, but certainly not the least important, is ensuring that the assessment is consistent with what you're trying to achieve in the first place. I also pointed out at one point the ideas of Gagne, which are really about an instructional sequence. It's particularly useful in the case of new teachers, where new teachers are struggling with the idea of how do I basically go about this. And it seems to me that Gagne is really useful in providing this sort of sequence, you know, that talks about getting people's attention in the first place, letting them know what the purpose of the session is, asking them what they already know about that topic. So this goes back to the business of building on what people already know. So effectively you're doing a gap analysis or a needs analysis at that point, to use slightly different language. Presenting the new material. That language of present new material, of course, is a particular sort of approach to teaching, which is what we're doing now. Often it may not be that you're actually presenting new material. It may be that what in actual fact you're doing is facilitating the learning process. And that's a different notion. Providing guidance to the learning, which is the facilitating bit, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that you'll find anything inconsistent between what you find in Gagne and what you'll find in Vela and what you'll find in those other sort of slides that we've seen before. And basically saying similar things in slightly different ways.